What's up guys, Tom Shepherd here at the Elite FTS compound once again. We're going to start our last series now on the different types of muscle contractions and the training methods that target them better. So the last series that we're going to do now is going to be the muscle contraction type we're almost familiar with, which is going to be the concentric muscle contraction. So that's the typical contraction where the muscle length is going to shorten whilst you contract. So just think like the upward phase of a bicep curl. The bicep is going to shorten whilst you perform that movement. Now, the concentric phase doesn't actually play as much of a role in hypertrophy as most people think. As we discussed in the previous videos, it's the eccentric phase, so the lowering phase where the muscle is stretching under load, where most of the muscle damage actually occurs, which is where the biggest hypertrophy stimulus comes from. However, when we perform the concentric phases, we can still get some hypertrophy response, but the mechanisms are a little bit different. So whereas on the eccentric phase, we physically get muscle damage from it being lengthened under load and essentially pulled apart, on the concentric phase, because it's more metabolically demanding, we get a greater buildup of metabolites and waste products. And the result of that is that in itself is a stimulus for the muscle to get stronger. So we get a buildup of lactate, and what that does downstream then is initiates the release of growth factors, and it inhibits myostatin and a few other things like that creates chemical cascades that help us then put on more muscle. But it's a different mechanism, and it's not the typical breaking down muscle mechanism that people usually associate with concentric contractions. Now, because there's not a lot of muscle damage directly that comes with concentric contractions, the good thing is that we can actually tolerate a high workload when it comes to these type of contractions. So as we'll show you in the next video, when we do methods that minimize the eccentric contraction, but focus mainly on the concentric contraction, because there's little muscle damage, that means we can do a higher volume of workload and still recover because the muscle damage is minimal. So that can be a very good thing for, say, athletes who are in season that need to keep their strength up and need to keep their weightlifting work at a certain level to maintain their performance, but they don't want the increased recovery demands of doing heavy eccentric-based work. Now, the other thing that's a little bit different with the hypertrophy response that you get from concentric actions compared to eccentric actions is actually the effect that it has locally on the muscle. Now, when we're looking at eccentric actions, we get more hypertrophy based towards the distal end of the muscle. So basically where the tendon attaches. So if you think on the bicep, lower down towards the elbow is where we will get a bit more local hypertrophy if we're looking at the stimulation from an eccentric contraction. If we're looking at a concentric contraction, the hypertrophy is a little bit more biased towards the muscle belly instead, because that's where you get a greater buildup of those metabolites that we spoke about. So I'm not saying that difference is going to be groundbreaking, but it can make a little bit of a difference in those who are a higher level and need to focus on kind of hypertrophy in certain places. Okay. So what we're going to do in the next few videos is going to go through methods where we show how you can bias the concentric part of the muscle action more and limit the eccentric action so that we can get more workload done with lower recovery demands. So the first kind of concentric based method that we're going to go over is what we kind of class as like as close to a pure concentric as we get. Now, pretty much no matter what you do, you're going to have to do an eccentric phase of a lift no matter what you do, unless you're doing deadlifts where you can drop the bar if you've got bumper plates and that kind of thing. But when we're doing lifts from pins to bias the concentric part of the movement, the goal is to control the eccentric phase as little as possible and put as much effort as possible to the concentric phase. So we've got a floor press bench set up here. We're going to show you some pin presses on here, just what that looks like. So the goal with the pin at the bottom is that we're going to start on the pin, and then between every rep, we're going to rest long enough that all the pre-activation from the muscles on the eccentric phase, which is going to be minimal, is going to dissipate, and also any stretch reflex or anything like that is also going to dissipate. So there's usually going to be about 3 or 4 seconds of time on the pin between your reps to allow that to happen. So we would start with the bar down on the pin. We would then roll it into position to mimic the position that the bar would be in on the main lift, and then give ourselves a second to build up tension and then press straight up. Then on the eccentric phase, it would be down with very minimal control, setting the bar back in the correct position, pressing up, and then minimal control on the way down, and again set up, press, and again pretty minimal on the way down. Now, as we said, the benefit of doing it like this is that because the eccentric phase is so diminished, then we get less muscle damage, we can handle more workload. The other benefit that we get is if you've got a certain sticking point, and this generally tends to work best at the bottom of the lift, because you're going from a dead stop every time, you can't use the momentum or the stretch reflex from the eccentric phase that comes before it to help you get through that sticking point. You have to teach your nervous system and your muscular system how to develop the force that's needed to move that weight from a dead stop with no kind of aiding factors, if you like. This works really well for the bench press, especially if your bottom position is weak and that's where you get stuck. It also works really well on the squat as well. It can work well for kind of mid-range as well, but the higher in the range that you go, generally the less carryover you will get from pins to your main lift afterwards. Okay, so the next question becomes then, if pin presses kind of have their drawbacks, why don't I just do things like board presses and box squats instead? That's a really good question, but they are different motor patterns and they have slightly different uses. So when we do something like a board press or a box squat, we have an eccentric phase that leads to the concentric phase. Now, we may be able to pause on the board or on the block, if it's a block pull, for example, or the box if it's a box squat. But there's still going to be an eccentric phase that activates the muscles in a certain way. And also, we're never going to be completely able to release the pressure of the weight when we're on the board or the box, whatever it is. When we're on the pin, we can bring the bar down and completely release muscular tension and essentially set up again from nothing. Whereas on a box squat or a board press, we can't do that. Now, that can be a good and a bad thing. It's good because it can allow us to use more weight, and it can also allow us then to better transfer what the gains from that particular movement into the full lift. However, what the downside that comes with that is that the eccentric phase, then the momentum that comes with it, can mask whatever the deficiency is at that point of the lift. So the pin press is good, for example, if you have like an instability or a neuromuscular problem at that sticking point, you need to wire your nervous system on how to fire your muscles and coordinate your muscles to get through that sticking point and create force at that exact joint angle. And then the board presses and the box squats, for example, can then be better once you've learned that to help you transfer it back through to that main lift. So we're just going to demonstrate the difference now. So we're going to do a board press here. So when we've got the board down, even if I use minimal control on the way down, I can't let go of the bar and completely release and then reset up. I have to stay rigid enough to support it to a degree. I can't do what I do on the pin and just let it come down. So because of that, even if I pause on the board for a few seconds, I still have a pre-activation effect from doing the eccentric phase. So because of that, the firing pattern is going to be a little bit different. So it becomes a bit less of a pure concentric movement because now there is a more significant amount of eccentric loading, which means we are going to be able to tolerate a little bit less workload on that pattern. But like I said, if you phase it correctly, that can help transition you from your pin work to your full range by acting as an intermediary between them. So the next concentric bias method that we're going to look at is sled work. So sled work is a really versatile tool that you can use to train your whole body as well as your legs. And again, the big benefit of sled work is that there is essentially no eccentric loading at all. So again, this can be great for us because it means the tolerable workload that we can recover from is going to be very high. And as we spoke about, the main benefit that you're going to get in terms of hypertrophy from concentric actions is going to come from that buildup of lactate and waste products in the muscles. Now, sled work, when we can be put under continual tension for a long period of time, is a really good way of building that up, especially when you do it for kind of longer distances in like the 80 to 100 meter range. So what we're doing is getting a lot of concentric based work. We're getting no impact. We're getting no eccentric loading. So there's very little muscle damage. So you can do sled based work probably 3, 4, 5 days a week, depending on how much volume you want to do in each session, and recover just fine. So again, this can be a great tool for people who maybe have another sport that they're currently playing, so they need to keep an eye on their recovery once they're in season training, or maybe even for someone who's got a lagging muscle group that needs to add extra workload for that muscle group, but without adding too much in the way of recovery demands for what they're doing. So obviously when we do the sled now, we've got the usual drags that we can do. Obviously you get different types of straps, things like that, but you can just do like your regular forward sled drags. And again, how much you lean forward when you do that is going to determine how much you end up biasing the posterior chain when you do it. And then you've got also the backward sled drag, which is going to be more quad loading. And again, you can either do this stood tall, and just lean back into it. Or if you really want to target your quads more, what you can do is instead of being in an upright position here, you can go down into a partial squat and stay down in a partial squat pattern and target your quads more like that. Now, not only that, if you need to work on your adductors and things like that, you can end up doing side steps, lateral steps with the sled. There's a whole variety of just leg-based movements that you can do with the sled. All right, so like I said, the sled isn't just a tool that you can use to train your legs and get the concentric-based benefits for that. If you've got a pair of handles like this, basically like a suspension trainer, then you can attach this to the sled, and then you've got a whole wide variety of exercises that you can do from there. So again, you can set up, pull tension into the handle and row and do sled rows. If you want to, you can do basically with a higher row and go for more like a face pull pattern. So again, you lean back, get tension, and then pull the elbows higher, like so. If you really want to, you could even turn it into a bicep workout. So again, squat down, get a little bit of tension into the handles, and then curl it back. And you could even face the other way with a pair of longer handles, turn it into a chest press or even a tricep extension. So again, you can get the benefits of the sled-based workout with the concentric benefit and none of the eccentric loading and the muscle damage, but just about any muscle group you want. If you've got the right attachment, you get creative enough with how you do it. Another category of exercises that are going to be essentially fall in the same range there as the sled work is loaded carries. Now again, we get the same benefits here. We get basically all concentric loading, no eccentric phase, but also now because we're moving with load, just like we are with the sled, we can also get a pretty high metabolic demand from these as well. So really you can program loaded carries and sled work for just about any tool that you want. Generally, the rule of thumb that I use is like 10 meters is going to be the equivalent of doing 1 rep on a traditional exercise. So if you're looking for more like muscular endurance and anaerobic fitness, you might do like say 70 to 100 meters. Then if you're looking for a lot more hypertrophy, you'd be down in like the 40 to 60 meter range. And then if you're looking for strength, then you'd be down below 40 meters, probably in the 10 to 30 meter range. Now, the benefit of loaded carries that have maybe more than the sled work is that they are better at creating full body stiffness. So they are better at teaching you how to get your whole body tight, which can then carry over better to the compound lifts, especially if that's a problem for you. Now, we're going to show you a couple of different variations here, but remember, the real thing that we want to kind of manipulate with the loaded carries is the rep range or the distance that we're doing them for, but also how we perform them. So we're not going to perform them like, say, pro strongmen would, where the goal is just get the weight to the end of the track in the minimal amount of time possible, because then we lose a lot of muscular tension because of the momentum and maybe the advantageous body position that we use to carry the momentum forward. So instead, when we have a distance to cover, we're instead going to do it at a reasonably slow pace, so basically like a walking pace, so that we keep better muscular contractions and better muscle tension throughout the entire range, and therefore we're going to get more hypertrophy and a better carryover to the main lifts that we're doing. Now, obviously, if you are a strongman that you compete in those events, you do also need to practice the method that allows you to move the most weight or move the weight the fastest. But for building those capacities, or just if you're doing it as a whole body strength tool, that isn't generally how you'd always train it. So the first one we're going to do here is an overhead carry. We're using some kettlebells here, but you could use a barbell, you could use dumbbells, whatever it is that you want to do. Likewise, you could do it one side at a time. It depends entirely on what your goal is. Now, I like kettlebells because the weight will sit on the forearm and it's a bit easier, so you don't have to grip as hard when you're carrying it overhead. So again, in the rack position, press overhead. Make sure that the arms are locked and extended, and the goal is to keep the rib cage down as we do the carry. Now, the whole time we want to make sure that we don't end up falling into extension and arching the rib cage up and arching the lower back, because that's going to take the pressure off the abs and put more pressure on the lower back. Likewise, what we don't want to see is the elbows start to dip, because then we're losing muscular tension off the triceps. And again, you can use dumbbells, you could use a barbell, or you could do that one side at a time. Now, if you are doing one-sided carries, the important thing to remember is that when we're doing them, we want to make sure that the shoulder girdle and the hips are still stacked. What we don't want to see when we do a one-sided carry is leaning. Because basically what we're doing then is, instead of compensating for the uneven load through muscular tension, we're just altering the leverages so that it's easier for us to do. Now, one of my other favorite loaded carry variations is a bear hug carry or a sandbag carry. So when you do this, you are going to need some kind of sandbag, or you could even use something like a med ball if they go heavy enough. And what we're going to do when we do this is bring it up to about sternum height, put the arms around it, kind of like if it was a light atlas stone, and then we're going to pull in hard as we can. The benefit of this one over, say, the overhead carry is that you're going to get a little bit more muscle stimulation for the pecs and for the biceps because of how we're holding it. Also now, because the load is around the sternum and the rib cage, it's going to compress the diaphragm a bit more and make it harder to breathe, which can then have a benefit in terms of its effect as a conditioning tool. So what we're going to do is lift up, lock the arms around it, actively pull in, stand nice and tall, and walk. Now the biggest fault that you're going to see here is people are going to start leaning back. So as they walk, they're going to start leaning back to leverage the weight back. And again, what that's going to do, it's going to take pressure off the abs and put it onto the lower back. So they're going to be here, whereas we want to be stacked vertical as if we weren't carrying a weight and we were just standing upright. So again, make sure that you cue people that they need to do that at all times and keep the weight pulled in so that it continues to depress the diaphragm and makes it harder to breathe.